Okay, so we've officially made it to March, which means that it's finally appropriate to start talking about one of my absolute favorite parts of the sports calendar, the World Acrobatic Gymnastics Championships in Azerbaijan. I'm kidding, obviously, although I'm sure that will probably be pretty awesome. But no, March means that it's time to start getting ready to fill out your bracket because the NCAA tournament will be upon us soon. In just a couple of weeks at the time of recording, we'll all be tuned in to Selection Sunday to see where and when our favorite team will be playing and reliving the annual tradition of pretending that we know way more about the sport than we actually do. America loves to fill out a bracket, even though it's pretty much inevitable at this point that the office pool will end up going to that one guy or girl who wouldn't know the difference between Mike Krzyzewski and Mike Wazowski. The exercise of filling out a bracket has pretty much been baked into the collective sporting conscience of the country, even though we all know by now that it's a fool's errand. Even for the people who do spend days out of their week watching games and tracking the KenPom rankings, no amount of knowledge can really prepare someone for the chaos that is the NCAA tournament. Because no matter how much you know, and no matter how perfect you might think your bracket is, the only thing you really need to understand about March Madness is that no bracket is truly safe from a good old-fashioned upset. Bracket busting is essentially a mathematical inevitability at this point. The sheer amount of games that the tournament encompasses now means that it's next to impossible for all the highest seeds in each region to move on. Sorry if any fans of teams like Gonzaga or Arizona are watching this, but that's just the reality. Sure, there's been the odd year or two where all four of the one seeds make it to the Final Four, but at this point, that's even more exceptional than a lower seed making it all the way. In fact, out of the 12 teams seeded 8th or lower that have won their region since the tournament expanded in 1985, 10 of them have been since the year 2000, and 7 of them have been since 2011. That's not even to mention all the one-off upsets that happen every year, which seem to also be getting more and more frequent. We live in a world where we've had a 1 seed, 2 seed, and 3 seed all lose in the first round in the past 3 tournaments, including the only time in the history of the sport that a top seed has gone out in their first game. The only real guarantee you can get in the modern tournament, as a competitor or as a person filling out a bracket, is that there are no guarantees of going through to the next round, no matter who you are. And when a team like George Mason or VCU or Loyola-Chicago makes it all the way to the Final Four, they leave absolute bracket carnage in their wake. I mean, just think about it for a second. As the tournament goes on, the teams those lower seeds have to beat theoretically get better and better. When Wichita State went to the Final Four in 2013, they had to beat the number 1 seed Gonzaga in the second round and the number 2 seed Ohio State in the regional final to get there. George Mason had a similar path in 2006, playing and beating a higher seeded team in every single round until they finally got knocked out by the eventual champions Florida in the Final Four. Pour one out for all the perfect brackets those guys ruined, but for a team like that to make it so far, they have to defy some serious odds. They're basically playing the lottery twice a week against some of the best teams in the country, and somehow winning every single time. But how does that happen, exactly? Pulling off an upset once is one thing. The team might have just overperformed or played against a team who couldn't shoot that night for some reason. But to keep doing it? That seems borderline impossible, and yet, it happens. Most people would chalk that kind of thing up to a cliche, like getting hot at the right time or riding the momentum of a big win. But it turns out that there are some psychological principles that underpin all of that, for both the team doing the upsetting and the team being upset. And we're going to take the few minutes to talk about them, because that's kind of what we do here. When we talk about an upset in the context of college basketball, we first need to define what that means. Because it's more than just a lower seed beating a higher seed. Decent teams from big conferences get at-large bids every year, and a couple of them always end up as a 10 or 11 seed. And it's not that much of a surprise if they beat a team ranked higher than them, because the expectation is that they'd be pretty good. A lot of what we talk about with upsets revolves around expectation, which the APA defines as the long-term average of a random variable. And while it's probably not exactly what you thought of at first, or at least it wasn't for me, I kind of love that definition because at a very basic level, that's exactly what's going on. If a team is expected to win, we would expect a greater number of trials to end up with that result. But because the NCAA tournament is single elimination, and therefore doesn't allow for a greater number of trials, there's a greater chance for that expected result not to happen. And that relationship between the expected result and the greater potential for failure in the context of the tournament creates what we refer to as pressure. The APA defines pressure as excessive or stressful demands, imagined or real, made on an individual to think, feel, or act in particular ways. The particular way to act in this case is winning the game, which the majority of people involved are going to expect the higher seed to do. And while they have probably earned that higher seed by being good, and should probably feel confident they're going to win because of it, that expectation can have some pretty adverse effects. According to something known as the Yerkes-Dodson law, or the Yerkes-Dodson curve, there's a kind of sweet spot of mental arousal, especially in complex tasks like winning a basketball game, where a certain level of expectation would actually be helpful. And that makes sense. A little bit of pressure is good. It helps keep you accountable to what you're capable of. But if you go past that point where pressure is healthy, you're probably going to run into some trouble. Too much pressure, whether it's internal or external, can lead to a state of mental arousal that a lot of research has shown to be unhelpful cognitively. If you're a high seed in a tournament and there's a lot of expectation and pressure on you to do well, that can create an increase in the activity of a kind of stress hormone called a glucocorticoid, the chief of which is a hormone called cortisol, which you may have heard of. Cortisol is one of the hormones connected to your body's stress response, and while, like pressure, the right amount of cortisol is very helpful, too much of it can become a real issue. High levels of cortisol cause impairments in concentration and memory, as well as anxiety and increased blood pressure, none of which are going to be particularly helpful if you're trying to beat a good basketball team, who, by the way, are experiencing none of those things because they aren't under the same level of scrutiny. And especially as you get deeper and deeper into a tournament, that effect becomes more pronounced, because the stakes and the pressure to win just get higher as the tournament progresses. So if you're trying to figure out how a lower seed knocks out a higher seed, especially in the later rounds of a tournament, there's a good chance that it's because the higher seed is feeling pretty anxious and aren't playing like they normally would because of it. But there's also a good chance that they're feeling the effects of something called reward prediction error, which I'll explain with a fun and completely not dumb visual metaphor. Let's say you're hankering for a snack at work, so you decide to take a little trip from your cubicle to the vending machine down the hall. I'm assuming that's how real jobs work. I, full disclosure, have no idea. But when you get to the vending machine, you put in your dollar and hit the button for your favorite candy bar. Now, you expect to get your favorite candy bar because that's what you asked for, and it's what you usually get when you hit that button. But let's say in this case, the machine gives you 2 candy bars. Well, now you're just delighted because that's above and beyond anything you could have imagined when you started this little journey. But the next time you go, maybe the machine is broken, and for some reason, the button doesn't work. That's obviously a pretty big bummer, so you just walk sadly and hungrily back to your desk, unaware that you've just experienced 2 different cases, what's known as reward prediction error. A correct reward prediction would have given you exactly what you expected, but a prediction error would have given you either too much or too little based on your original expectation. And that's exactly what I think carries those lower seeds through multiple rounds of games against better teams, because the reward they get from beating a team ranked higher than them is way bigger than just an extra candy bar. And when I say reward, what I'm really talking about is an influx of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. You may have heard of dopamine because it's the neurotransmitter most commonly associated with your reward pathway. Not coincidentally, it's also what a drug like cocaine uses to affect your brain, but more on that in a minute. In the event that a team is expected to win, the reward for doing so is not going to be as great. Their correct reward prediction would just be moving on to the next round, so the only error really available to them would be to fail to reach that goal. Conversely, the team that isn't expected to win has basically nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their predicted reward is a loss, so getting a win means more to them than it would to the higher seeded team. And the theory is that because the prediction error would be bigger the lower you go in the bracket, so too would the reward. To put it another way, if a 10 seed got 2 candy bars for beating a 7 when they expected nothing, then a 16 seed would get like 48 candy bars or something for beating a 1 seed. And in theory, that level of reward would carry through to the next round, because the greater the reward available, the greater effects of receiving it would be, and the motivation to get it again would be higher too. A team that's just pulled off a massive upset is going to come into their next game on a literal dopamine high. And because of the principles of operant conditioning, which we talked about in the episode about Romelu Lukaku, they're going to do their best to repeat the behavior that got them that reward in the first place. It doesn't hurt either that literally everyone outside the fans of the other team is going to be rooting for them to win. Basketball fans love an upset, and that extra positive reinforcement from fans and media around the country can also give the lower seeded team a boost. Like, I'm sorry, Kansas fans, but literally everyone was rooting for you guys to lose to Davidson in 2008, and we're pretty bummed out when you didn't. And while that kind of reaction doesn't make you inherently worse at basketball, it can make you feel worse, which, as we've discussed, can accomplish pretty much the same thing. At the end of the day, trying to figure out why one team wins and one team loses is about as easy as trying to turn metal into gold, let alone figuring that out for an entire 64-team bracket. But in the case of the NCAA tournament, there does seem to be a unique level of possibility that a lower-seeded team would be able to beat the odds, and even do it more than once. The most important variable, which team ends up winning, is still who has the better players, and it always will be. But those players are people, and people, especially younger ones, are vulnerable to psychological lapses and pressures, especially when there are high stakes and lots of moving parts. No matter how good a team is, the expectations of others and the pressure they create can still bring them down in the right circumstances. Just ask Virginia in 2018, or Duke in 2012, or any number of other teams. And if a team can pull off an upset, like Florida Gulf Coast did in 2013, the reward and positive reinforcement that they get from that victory, as well as from the entire country rooting for them, may take them way further than they could have ever gone otherwise. She's a complicated web to try and untangle, this bracket stuff. Who wins and who loses seems like complete chaos, and sometimes it is. But it isn't completely random. And understanding the brain activity that makes up that complexity can make watching it all unfold an entirely different experience. Because whether you predict it correctly in your bracket competition or not, anarchy is coming. But now, at least, you'll hopefully understand it a little bit better. Hey everybody, I'm Will, and I have to confess that I am an absolute sucker for March Madness. Even if I don't know a thing about the teams playing, I find myself getting absolutely sucked into the storylines playing out over those couple of hours. And I think that's most people's experience, and one of the things, apart from the chance for a big upset, that makes the tournament so incredibly popular. If you feel so inclined, please put who you think is going to win this year's tournament in the comments. I'm legally not allowed to pick Auburn, so for me, I've got to think that Duke's going to put it all together for Coach K's final season. That's probably more motivation than any amount of dopamine can provide in and of itself, but also, they may feel the pressure and get knocked out in the first round. Who knows? But until we can see it all play out for real, I'm Will, and I'll see you guys next time.